Yeah, so looking at the exclusive economic zone here, sorry for the pause there. We get to hone in on a couple key concepts and things to consider when assessing coast. I want to read you just a little section here, and I'll include it, more of it on the next slide, but this is from the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. In the early 80s, the exclusive economic zone was established. And it says the EEZ is an area beyond and adjacent to the territorial sea, which is up to 12 nautical miles offshore, and under which the rights and jurisdiction of the coastal state here in the United Nations terminology, of course, referring to nation state, or as we would in common parlance refer to country. The coastal state and the rights and freedoms of other states under governed by the relevant provisions of this convention. The exclusive economic zone shall not extend beyond 200 nautical miles from the baselines from which the breadth of the territorial sea is measured. And so this notion of the EZ corresponding to the territorial sea, and the territorial sea being these 12 nautical miles offshore, being defined by each state, by each country, and extending 12 nautical miles from where they define the coastline. So again, highlighting some of these importance of how we define coast, just on a geopolitical scale, if you will, or international, administrative. We'll get to fleshing that out in a little bit, but just to look a little closer here at this definition of the EEZ, and yeah, give you a second to pause and read through some of that. And just to add to that a little bit, the continues on to say the EEZ, the coastal state, has sovereign rights for the purpose of exploring and exploiting, conserving, and managing the natural resources, whether living or non-living, of the waters superjacent. Interesting term there by the UN, combining super and adjacent to the seabed, and of the seabed and its subsoil, with regard to other activities for economic exploitation and exploration of the zone, such as the production of energy from water, currents, and winds. So really highlighting here some key economic, and we could even we could even argue that is some key geopolitical, or beyond some political economic was the word I was looking there for, in the notion from critical geography that things aren't just purely economic. We need to recognize that there are immense power relations wrapped up in some of these contexts or issues, exploitation of the zone, production of energy, whether it be from wind, water, currents, or mineral resources. So we see here the continental shelf mapped out in red in areas around the world, and this relates very intimately with the exclusive economic zone, based on territorial claims, territoriality, as we would say in critical social science and other realms. We can see, obviously there's an effect of the Mercator projection here used for the map, but we can see some areas having very large and extended continental shelves, and how mapping plays a role in that. Here we see Canada's coastal zone. In 2013, Canada filed a submission to the UN regarding its continental shelf and wanting to readjust the borders of that in the Atlantic Ocean. We see that white zone here extending out beyond the red zone, and also submitting preliminary information concerning the outer limits of its continental shelf in the Arctic. And yeah, so just those relating to the continental shelf, they have big impacts on the exclusive economic zone, a host of other international treaties concerning the Arctic here. They play into effects on international shipping lanes already established in the Arctic and control of those. And yeah, so territoriality is a big issue, not in just a pejorative sense, but in legal terms. All this stemming back to how we map or define our coast. To give a few other examples of that to kind of round this out for us, there's a range of different definitions of coast around the world, and we'll just highlight some of these at different scales. Of course, New Brunswick here, the first of which we have on the landward extent, from the coast extending inland. Pretty neat word, landward. We don't often see that. Generally, this is taken from their official documentation, their legalese, if you will. Generally 500 meters landward from natural features, and they have identified 3 zones. Zone A is the core area. This is the most sensitive coastal area, closest to the water, extending between high water, large tide, and low water, large tide. Zone B, the buffer area extending 30 meters landward of Zone A. And Zone C, a transition area between the coastal and inland areas, Zone B. A lot of this would get pretty text heavy if we were to include all that, but it's just the intention here is just to give some verbal examples of how these different jurisdictions have divided their coastal zones or their coastal definitions even. From there we can contrast this a bit with Portugal, another coastal state. And which is interesting here, they have 2 kilometers inland from the line of the highest equinoctial tides. So just a really interesting adjective of equinox, literally, that they're using for their official definition. The equinox, of course, most of you are very familiar with from your physical, geography, or other courses, but the technical definition here, just to get us on the same plane, is the equinox is the astronomical event, so different than the meteorological marking of the seasons, which we most often think of the equinox associated with. The astronomical event in which the plane of the Earth's equator passes through the center of the sun. This occurs, of course, twice a year, autumn and spring, but so on the equinox, day and night are of equal duration all over the planet, is the information provided by the previous professors here for this slide. And it's interesting because how it's officially integrated into a nation state's definition of a coast. And on the seaward extent, they have to 30 meters, what they're calling bathymath, or bathymath, on the 30 meters in depth of the ocean water column. And then to contrast that once more, we have Queensland, Australia, all areas landward side of the coastal waters in which there are physical features, ecological and natural processes, or human activities that affect or potentially affect the coast. So a very broad scope here in Queensland's definition, incorporating numerous different variables in terms of physical features, ecological, human activities. And then on the seaward side, we have 3 nautical miles seaward of the low water mark. Again, begs the question of how the low water mark is defined, and that's something we'll take a look at in the mini lectures to come as well. And lastly here, though, we have Alaska, the state of Alaska. It's a small lowercase s in this case. Just north of here, three zones identified again, similar to New Brunswick. And on the landward side, though, just to start, we have their landward is technically variable based on biophysical relationships, to sum that up. And on the seaward side, from a baseline seaward from the, must have left off the technical baseline there, whether low water or high water or a mean between them, but extending 3 nautical miles. So quite an extensive range there, similar to Queensland. They also have 3 zones identified: the zone of direct interaction, zone of direct influence, and then the zone of indirect influence. So direct interaction, area where physical and biological processes are a direct function of contact between sea and land. Direct influence zone, area closely affected and influenced by the close proximity of land and sea. And then indirect influence, area beyond the zone of indirect influence, but the limit of identifiable land-sea interaction. So again, a varying gradient here of how we can establish specific zones for management, for mapping, for presenting this to the public in these cases in terms of the legal boundaries. We have a diagram here from the BC government in terms of ownership and jurisdiction of BC's coastal shores, and the multiple agencies, levels of jurisdictions that are involved. So you have the corresponding to different water lines as well: storm tide, high tide, low tide. And down here with ownership in terms of the province, in terms of inland seas, the federal government in terms of the outer coast, the foreshore intertidal zone being managed by the province, the backshore being landowners, whether that be public or private. And then we get down into jurisdiction, inland seas being to the local government boundary, local government spanning inward to outward, inland sea bridging into the province. On a spectrum there. This is played out in a local context in Gonzales Bay here in Victoria, with conflict over development of large mansions extending onto high tide rocks. Not just high tide, rocks that are exposed at low tide, and how the development was stopped by the city so that the province could come in. The provincial Ministry of Environment could come in and weigh in on how the developer and contractor was extending this large mansion out into the sea there, out into Gonzales Bay. So I'll try to come up with some images of that and post them later for you, but just came to mind here as we're going over this image, how there can be quite intersecting jurisdictional ownership or management of areas, and how those don't often divide up neatly. And underlying this all, of course, we see the indigenous perspective that would not create boundaries between these specific zones, that this is a continuum, and that these elements are very much interwoven. It's interesting that the BC government would include that on there. And to continue that thread just a little bit, the principle of interconnectedness that it speaks to is very fundamental to integrated planning and management, which is something the BC government is working more towards and has a long way to go, admittedly by itself, and arguably by those critical of the amount that it is initiating First Nations consultations. Getting back to the Guayhanas the marine protected area that we saw up above in the presentation, with the 2 islands there being mapped out in 4 different ways. They refer in that paper to this Haida principle. I'm not going to try to pronounce it but the principle that speaks to specifically to everything depending on everything else. This is a key part of the Haida view and many other indigenous groups of land management, if we could use that term even, but how that's being integrated into planning and management in an integrated planning sense. How it's being implemented is the verb that I should have used there, in integrated planning, which we'll look a lot more at as later in the semester. But yeah, for now, how this, we can just put it in our minds that it's a comprehensive approach, considering accounting for short-term and long-term and cumulative effects of human activities on the environment, instead of just compartmentalizing these different zones and activities, and how recognizing how integrated planning can recognize different spatial and temporal scales. Some of those which we've seen mapped out in just these two brief presentations. We can think about the different spatial and temporal scales that we've been looking at, because especially spatial, but how interconnected and integrated planning takes account for both of these sets of scales. Scale, of course, being something that's, just to reiterate some of our geographic principles or concepts, scale is something that we'll hear emphasized over and over in this course, and repeatedly in a lot of your other courses too, it being a very central concept that we clue in a lot in geography, numerous other disciplines, but especially because of the insights that it provides in recognizing patterns and distribution across space. And so along those lines, we can skip one there. We can continue that how we're this perspective or different viewpoints that we're taking to coast, to work here towards coast as a perhaps zone of influence, right? Not being these discrete sections. Another viewpoint here to look at is the coast as a zone of influence. And we have a quote here from the paper, that part of the land affected by its proximity to the sea and that part of the ocean affected by its proximity to land. An area in which processes, depending on the interaction between land and sea, are most intense. So setting up a continuum there again, in terms of continuum of intensity, how we can pinpoint, how we can't pinpoint from the other way of looking at it, a specific area, but how we can try to clue in on the areas of most intensity. However, by this definition, coastal zones could be just a wafer-thin strip of coastline, not more than a few kilometers wide, extending from the low tide mark inland, or they can extend inland as far as to include entire watersheds, may run seaward to the continental shelf, encompassing the full extent of a country's 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, the EEZ, right? So this is it's quite broad scope in this definition. If we could just be only but a few kilometers wide, extending from the low tide mark inland, ranging all the way to include the entire continental shelf, in terms of the exclusive economic zone as well. So there's quite a bit of range of variance there. From there, we can begin to see this coastal zone in terms of a few different key variables that we're looking at here, that we've highlighted throughout the presentation. It's a space in which the terrestrial environments influence marine environments and vice versa. The coastal zone is of variable width. We also change in time based on numerous factors, storms, tectonics, get into some of those, into first order processes such as plate tectonics, changing coastlines in the following mini lecture. and also the delimitation, just a fancy word for, synonymous with delineation really, but the delimitation of zonal boundaries is normally not possible because of the amount of variables that we're working with. More often such limits are marked by environmental gradient or transition. So yeah, quite an important variable coming up from these considerations that we've seen is this notion of a gradient or transitions. And these need not, and in fact rarely do, coincide. Right? There can be exclusivity between them. The landward boundary of the coastal zone is particularly vague, and since oceans can affect the climate far inland from the sea. Arguably, even Eastern Ontario is experiencing climates affected by marine climates all the way in the Pacific. I mean, you could just go anywhere in the world and someone can unwind the clock, so to speak, in terms of how weather that they're experiencing or the climate of one area actually extends from the westward or eastward ocean even, depending on your wind currents there. So it speaks to how these landward boundaries can be especially vague. And to get here then to our summary, you've been listening to me talk for another 21 minutes here, so we're encouraged to keep these asynchronous videos shorter, much shorter than you'd be used to watching on a live Zoom call, if you will. So that's why we're trying to punctuate them with shorter videos here. But to summarize, the coast can be defined as a margin or linear boundary, usually assigned a sea level depending on the purpose. Can be. Right? Came across several problems in doing that. But due to different vertical data or scales, there are wide inconsistencies when mapping coastal areas. Along these lines, the coast can be defined as an area of transition or gradients between land and sea. And to flesh out some of the boundaries of that transition, or the lack of boundaries in some case, can be either fixed or variable. Right? In terms of fixed, we have specified zones, physical, oceanographic, ecological, administrative. But then, speaking to the lack of clarity in those boundaries, that can be variable, such as the function of biophysical processes and human activities, even for that matter, how they extend in and out of specific zones. Even across nation states, how human activities are not confined often in coastal areas to one nation state or the other, let alone within a country. Look at more of that as the semester progresses as well. But that human activities that determine the extent of influence in interaction. And so this, influence interaction, how these human activities really play into this variable nature of boundaries, and also the biophysical processes, how they very much illustrate the variable boundaries of coast, quote unquote. How it's often impossible to separate out human activities from biophysical. Right? This is the keystone of a geographic lens, how these are completely interdigitated, and that when we take a sharper viewpoint, we can begin to tease out how problematic it is to separate biophysical from other notions of them being separate. Yeah, so a lot more to come on that, and for now I'll just leave it there, and I want to welcome your questions here in the discussion board, and yeah, thanks for listening, and look forward to hearing more from you. Thanks.